Welcome, friends. I am so excited to have you for this episode of Authority. This is my dear friend Pam Sheppard, who has been doing publishing things for a very long time. I will let her fully introduce herself, but she is an absolute delight, and I'm so happy she's here today.
Oh my
So,
gosh, Ellis, you just know the better part of me. I am not a delight. I am not
I
a
think
delight.
you're a delight.
Well, we meet on many levels here.
Right, you're a delight to
Um,
me.
I've got a lot of road wear, is what it is, and that's my own term for all the years I spent on the road selling books. I have been. My mother had a bookstore when I was in college, and I worked in the bookstore and got hired right out of the bookstore to work for Simon and Schuster. I was the first woman that they had hired to put on the road, so it was really dicey. There were only 5 women on the road at the time. That was in the 70s. But I've retired from that, and actually I've been doing developmental editing for about 20 years, in between the times when I was selling books. But when I retired, I thought, oh, I'm just going to be an editor. And as it turns out, yeah, I'm an editor. I'm a good editor with all these books in my past. But what is interesting is that the editing meshes with the fact that I sold books through many decades, saw
Hmm.
many things that happened with the business, saw many things that happened with the marketplace. And that turns out to be more valuable at times as a partner to editing.
Yep.
So, where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the editing, or do you want to start with the marketplace?
Well, I was kind of hoping that we could start by talking a bit about the market because I know understanding the market also affects the editing. And
Yes.
so I want to talk about like how to position your book in the marketplace because that is a question a lot of authors have. Like, okay, I have this thing. Now how do I sell it? And I have so
Okay.
many people talking about like what genre is my book and they're trying to make it a genre it's not, and that happens a lot too.
Well, as someone who has sold books, and every season I had 2 or 3 seasons a year, and every season there would be probably 800 to 1200 books in the catalog, but maybe 200 or 300 that were really important to sell.
Mhm.
Okay. So what happened after doing that for so long is that anytime I hear about the book, the voice in the back of my head says, "How am I going to sell this sucker?" You know, and and that's the way we approach it. Now, when I talk about positioning, I want to make it clear that you really can't position tightly. You have to understand what the marketplace is, what your book is, what the strengths of your book is, and what's going on out in the marketplace.
Mhm.
The vivid example of that is the COVID shutdown.
Yep.
Nobody wanted to read certain books in the COVID shutdown. They wanted to read baking books.
Yep.
That's an acute example of what happens in the marketplace. When there is an election, there are always political books that are out there. Now, do you want to position your book with those political books because that's what's going on in the marketplace, or against it? There are very clear reasons that romance and contemporary women's fiction is doing very well right now,
Yep.
because it balances all the other political books and contemporary history books.
And the world right now, sometimes you just need to escape into something fluffy
Right.
and predictable and pleasant.
So the first point to make about positioning your book is what's happening in the marketplace. Now, that assumes that your book is ready to go into the marketplace, which brings up the topic that we talked about earlier, you and
Mhm.
I, privately, about writing to market.
Yep.
That's a really dicey proposal, because if you write to market, by the time you finish, the market might be doing something else.
Yep.
So the better thing to do is write what message you want to write. If
Mhm.
you want to write clearly into a genre, great. That message is very laid out for you. But say you have a memoir. What do you want to say with your memoir? What do you want to say with your self-help book? What do you want to say with your fiction? What is the message?
Mhm.
So the editing hat that I wear to get that is, make sure your message is clear and strong and authentic.
Yeah.
Because once you get those strengths together, you can compare it to the genre, and then compare it to the marketplace. An example I have is that I did a marketing brief for a memoir recently, and I we went through the elements of the brief that were pertinent to her marketing plans. And I finally said, "All right, are you sitting down?" And I said, "You know what? This isn't a memoir. This is fiction. This is a romance." And she said, "Oh my God." She said, "Yes, it is. Let's do it." That was the thing about she was writing to her personal message, trying to meet the genre conventions,
Yeah.
but her message was much more a different genre. And you apply the fact that the marketplace is really tough for memoir right now. There's just
Yes.
a saturation of it. But there is not a saturation for contemporary women's romance or
Mm-hmm.
for contemporary women's experience. So that is the way to mesh what's going on. Get your message straight, write it well, let your strengths and authenticity come out. And then we look at the marketplace to see how to position it.
So, what I'm hearing you say is basically tell your story, how you're going to tell it, and lean into what you want your story to be. Like, really lean into your message, your story, who you are, what you want to do, and then worry about how am I going to sell this afterwards. Yeah?
I think that that is the way to approach it as a writer.
Mm-hmm.
You will eventually have to put on your hat to say, how do I market it? But especially for new writers, you do want to take a look at certain conventions. You want to look at structural conventions. You want to look at maybe genre conventions. You know, um, I think everybody is so different, and every editor is so different that leave it open for that. But it's really important to have a premise. What are you trying to say with this story? Where do
Mm-hmm.
you want it to go? And it doesn't matter what you're writing. You have to have a premise that is solid.
Yep. Yeah, and a lot of the times the premise isn't just the plot, it's what you're trying to tell. Like
Exactly.
my series, my urban fantasy series ultimately comes down to the idea that anybody can choose to be different or be better at any time. There's no point where you can't make a decision to do something differently and become a better person that it doesn't matter. There's no point. And that's kind of the
That's a very solid premise that you wrap your story around and you
right,
make
like
sure you express that premise.
yeah, on my website, on my author website, it says I tell stories to tell the truth. And that is how I kind of approach things. Is for example, in Cold Front, the novel that my most recent one, the main character Snow, her story, her truth is that she does not like herself at all, and she thinks she's an awful person because she's a former spy and she uses people as easily as breathing because that's what she's trained to do. And her story is kind of coming to grips with who she is as a person and deciding maybe she can be more than that, and the influence of people actually being allowed into her world emotionally and how that changes the way she behaves. Um, that's not a spoiler either. And that kind of thing, like deciding what the heart of your story is.
Exactly. Exactly. Are you the especially in terms of the way the culture has defined story.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it hasn't defined story around the message as much as it is entertain me,
Yeah.
make me laugh, make me cry, all those other elements. And it doesn't exactly serve a writer who wants to say something but doesn't always know how to say it or how to aim at what they're saying.
Mm-hmm.
You can vomit out all kinds of stuff, but what are you trying to say is always, you know, and what are you trying to say is the writer's responsibility. When you get to marketing, how are you going to sell that sucker is the
Mm-hmm.
thing you ask.
So, how do you know if you've written your book in a way that tells your story, has that like message that you're trying to say? How do you know you've accomplished that?
The basic structural elements are, no struggle, no story,
Yeah.
you know, and I think that the variations of that formula are endless. And I also always say that there are three people in your story. They've got the writer, you've got the protagonist, and you've got the reader. always remember that someone is reading this and you have a responsibility to tell this story in a way that they keep paying attention.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are some stories that someone will say, I'm not interested, and they toss it aside. But for the people who like this kind of story, keep them engaged.
Yep, I've talked before about how some stories just aren't for some people, kind of like I don't like pineapple on pizza. It's not my thing. That doesn't mean that pineapple on pizza is wrong or bad, but doesn't matter if it's the best pineapple pizza on the planet. I'm still not going to like it. It's not for me.
But you know, the real joy of being in this business is to have somebody say, I never read this stuff, but I really like this,
Yep.
you know?
Yep.
And for that whole thing, I would highly recommend not tying too tightly to conventions or rules, because there are ways to express them that still tells a good story.
Mm-hmm.
And at the root of it is something that's relatable to the most number of people.
Yeah, I think that's really the power of story is that ability to relate to a character. I don't care if that character's wearing a space fleet uniform,
Right,
medieval armor,
right.
or jeans and a t-shirt. If they are experiencing something and exploring something in their world that I can really relate to and understand and that impacts me, that's the story I'm going to stick with. I mean, I might not exactly be a sci-fi fan, but Anne McCaffrey's one of my favorite authors. And it's not because she was a sci-fi author, it's because the Pern series just grabbed me as a kid and I related so hard to some of the characters in it that I didn't care that it was sci-fi. I didn't really understand it was sci-fi as a kid because it had dragons in it, but you know. um, but it didn't really matter. It was about the characters.
Yeah,
And that's one of the
you can relate
reasons.
to it.
Yeah,
And,
that's.
and you know, I was just thinking about the book Remarkably Bright Creatures, where the octopus is as much a character as the regular human. But what was wonderful is that you can relate to what this octopus wanted to get back to the ocean, out of the aquarium,
Mm-hmm.
and that drove the story forward. you know and it's this is what drives a story forward, is that you want to see something happen. My book club recently read a book that they hated, and I just sat back as an editor smiling, because they hated the character. And I said, now look, uh, the author did exactly what she wanted to do. She wanted to make you hate this character.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the time, you love the character, you want to see them triumph. You didn't like this character, you wanted to see them taken down. That was very successful. It was a complete flip of what your expectations as a reader are. And that writer played your expectations like an orchestra. She played it so that you hated this person, and she did finally get it in the end. And that's a very real part of
Mm-hmm.
putting your premise together, putting your message together. And then you have to take it to the marketplace. So what the heck
Yep.
do you do next?
So, say you have this book that you're really passionate about, that you feel you've got this message that is really something you care about. At that point, what is the step that you take? Say your book is a little offbeat with what people expect for the genre. Like, what do you do with that? Because everybody tells you, no, you have to conform to genre expectations. You have to do exactly what readers expect. And you're saying, well, I mean, this author wanted to make you hate the protagonist, and she did a great job at it. So how do you position a book that is a little off kilter? Like, what do you do?
I was just thinking about um, how I would take a book that was different into a bookstore to a buyer to make sure they bought it.
Mm-hmm.
It's all the part of how am I going to sell this sucker. You know, there is a marketplace factor, but there's also the community factor next, where this is the bookstore, they can sell this stuff. Usually by the time I go from the front door to the buyer's desk, I know what kind of books they sell. So you tilt it to the kind of books they sell. So you're going to take your book and tilt it to the kind of books that somebody reads. And the ideal reader formula,
Mm-hmm.
I find, is too narrow, because an ideal reader is somebody who reads.
Yeah.
And often somebody who reads will read anything, but maybe you're starting with the tightest possible ideal reader, the one who reads books about chocolate bars.
Okay.
You know, okay. But maybe somebody who reads nothing but sci-fi would like to read about a chocolate bar too. How do you connect them? How do you connect them?
Mm-hmm.
So the process of figuring out your genre, your reader, the pool of readers who potentially can read your book. Yes, you start with the genre. Then you start looking for your comps. And I see people just cringe when I say the word comps because that's a
Yep.
very difficult thing to do. I've done comp analysis for independent publishers, which is often very helpful in figuring out a way to sell the book.
Mm-hmm.
Because, but I also listened to a New York Times book review podcast where they were talking about the books that they had reviewed, which was wonderful,
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. I love the way they look at these books because they're looking at what works, what doesn't work,
Yep.
yada, yada, yada. And at the end of the podcast, they said, well, it comps to this and it comps to that. And I said, wait a minute. I know this business. I have never heard of those comps that you did. I have never heard of those. So it started to make me feel like, are comps really that important? Yeah, they're a starting point.
Mm-hmm.
And there are rules around comps. Rules, you know,
Yep.
everything is everything has a porous boundary in my world. Um, they say you comp to this, but you don't comp to that. You comp to this, you don't comp to that. What is similar? You know, a whole genre emerged out of Hogwarts.
Yep.
A whole genre of whether they is it dark academia.
Yeah.
It developed out of merely the presence of a school for wizards. All right. What is an element of your book? An element, not the whole book, not the fact that it's a bestseller, not the what is the strength of your book that is the similar to the strength of another book? Is it the setting? Is it a character who is a mess? So you find another book where the character is a mess. You know,
So comps don't have to be the same genre as you necessarily?
you start there. You can start there, but do you want to read a book about someone who triumphs? Does it matter if they're in fantasy, in contemporary, or
Mm-hmm.
in sci-fi?
Right. And also
But
stories
you also
can,
you also are wanting to invite all kinds of readers.
yes.
You want to invite the ones who like to read about chocolate bars,
Mm-hmm.
but you go from there.
Yeah.
Your story is about a school for misfits. That's a good comp right there.
Yep.
It's similar to a book about misfits the way Hogwarts is a school for wizards.
Mm-hmm.
That's enough to invite a reader.
Yeah, so the idea of a comp is to say, if you enjoyed this story, you're probably going to enjoy mine because it's got some similar core elements of this.
Yeah, yeah, and I think considering that you're dealing with consumers,
Mm-hmm.
they want the shortcuts.
Yep.
They want the shortcuts.
Yeah, what shelf would it be on? Like what book would it be next to on the shelf that would make sense?
Well, that would be for writers to figure that out, but the consumer doesn't care. They just want a good story.
Yeah.
Why did Remarkably Bright Creatures sell? Not because it was a story, it was a story. It was a story that actually made an octopus into a thinking being.
Yep.
You know, I read that. I'll read that, you
Mm-hmm.
know. Uh, um, and a lot of people who read other genres might be interested in that too. So, but that is the strength of that book is that it surprises people by giving an animal not thought to be sentient a sentient personality.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and that attracted readers of all kinds.
Yeah.
But
So,
when I want a candy bar, I want a candy bar.
right. So
I
when you're looking at comps, you're looking at a narrow space to begin with to say, okay, who is the person I'd be on the shelf next to? For me,
right,
it would be Jim Butcher, probably, because my books are very
good,
similar to the Dresden Files in genre, if somewhat similar in tone, albeit very different in other ways. But it's still because my world has magic out in the open where Dresden does not. There's differences, but it's enough that I could be like, yeah, this could be on a shelf next to that book comfortably. And then who are the readers who go after that? How do I find them? Is usually my next step. But I could say take that in a different angle where I would look at another book series where a main character is an outcast, maybe not urban fantasy, but somebody who experiences the idea of being completely cast out and having to completely relearn everything in their world. And maybe not about fantasy because it's not about the fantasy, it's about the experience. But I could grab another book off a shelf that is a different genre and say it's sort of like this one too. And how do I reach those people?
It's, I think that we do not have the kind of reach we think we do.
No.
I believe that publishers make it their priority to make bestsellers, but they make the bestsellers by using the publicity and the backup of a few bookstores and distributors who
Mm-hmm.
will respond at the same time. They get all the soldiers going in the same
Yeah.
direction. What we have now, the only thing we have that addresses readers and reaches out to readers is Amazon and Goodreads. You know,
Those are, I think social media plays a part in it too, because,
social media does play a part, yes, and that is the vehicle that takes a writer to readers. And while I think we all dream of having a bestseller, first that we dream of is writing a really good book that we're proud
mm-hmm.
of.
Yes,
Okay, and then if it actually, um, I'm sorry,
that's okay. Life
I
happens.
I didn't turn that on. I'm going to have to let that ring. Um, Actually, where was I?
You were saying you would really like to, you need to bring a book that you're excited to readers, but also finding those readers in a marketplace is hard for indies because we don't have all those soldiers in a row like traditional
Right.
publishing does.
And that's for the wide. I like to recommend that you have your message very well defined. You have your book professionally produced, which
Mm-hmm.
you don't have to always have a professional do it, but you do need to compare it to the checklist of
Yep.
how it looks good. If it's bound right, if it's the margins are right, if it's formatted
Yep.
right, all those things. Um, but I think that when you're looking for comps, you're looking for the communities.
Mm-hmm.
You know, for instance, Samantha Irby, she's very sarcastic essayist and makes you laugh out loud. Now, who likes to read sarcastic essays? You know, there you go. There's your beginning.
Yep.
So Amazon provides you with also reds.
Mm-hmm.
Amazon provides you with communities. They provide you with the editorial, um, uh, the editorial segments from a well-reviewed book, and you see where was it reviewed, who reviewed it,
Okay.
is there a community connected to that, is there a community connected to Samantha Irby? I used her in a review of such things where the also bots had various different types of people who also wrote humorous essays. But then there was one that cross-referenced her sarcastic humorous essay with a whole new topic. That's where you go to find a new community.
Okay. So
I hope that's clear that
it's
you.
kind of doing some almost archaeology on the books that you say would be similar to yours and the authors who are similar to yours and find their communities. And you're not suggesting, of course, I'm sure, just throwing an ad for your book into a fan space for that,
Oh no, that
because
ads are
that's a terrible plan.
no. It's a terrible plan. That's not what you do, because I feel that authors need to be community based.
Yes.
I worked with a woman who did a really nice series of cozies set in the mountains, in a mountain community, and she's taken it to the mountain community and sold 90 copies at a show where she did
Nice.
an autograph. Yeah, which is marvelous. And she does it. She works locally out from the center.
So, for example, my book is set in Boston. Going to a book event in Boston to sell a book set in Boston to Boston nerds, like at a comic convention, which would be probably where a lot of my readers would hang out, would be a good idea because it takes it to a
Imagine.
place full of people who are at least tangentially interested in what I'm doing. And
Absolutely.
ta-da.
And then the tenor of your presentation, the stagecraft of your
Mm-hmm.
presentation draws in somebody else where they may not they for instance, my fantasy writer, people buy her book because they like her.
Mm-hmm.
They think she's cool.
Yep.
Okay, I've never read a fantasy, but it's your book, so I'm gonna buy it.
Yep,
And
I've
by
definitely
oh,
done that.
surprise, surprise, she loves it when somebody says, "I never read this stuff, but I really liked what you wrote."
Yep.
You know, that is
I have
particularly satisfying.
I have friends who are authors who I've definitely done that with, where I've bought books that are definitely not a genre I normally read, but I really enjoy their writing. I love them and I want to support them, so I buy their book and I read their book and I'm like, wow, you know what? That was really good.
So, just to recap, what we're talking about is get your message clear, write it beautifully, do
Mm-hmm.
a really strong job getting it written well, and then try to match up with people who like you and
Mm-hmm.
are like you.
Yep.
You know, I think that to participate in other writers' communities is a factor of participating,
Yep.
where they come to know you because what you bring to the community is all yours, whether
Mm-hmm.
it's your observations, whether it's your crankiness, whether it's your personality, whether it's your cat pictures, who cares?
Yep.
They get to know you by what you bring to the table. And then when
Definitely.
you say, oh, by the way, my book is releasing, oh, I didn't know you were a writer, I think I'll buy that book because I like you.
Mm-hmm.
So these are the factors that you bring to selling your book into the marketplace. Your marketplace is small, your marketplace is made up of several communities, and if you're lucky, it reaches bigger and bigger communities.
Yeah, there's a concentric circles kind of ripple effect, hopefully. And you touched on something that I think a lot of people underestimate these days is writing the book beautifully. There's a lot of people who think that just putting something together and getting it published is enough, but the craft
Well,
oftentimes gets
yeah.
overlooked in that process.
Well, my first discovery along those lines is that people don't realize that there are four kinds of editors. When they say the word editor, they think, oh, all I have to do is
Yep.
run it through software to fix my punctuation.
Yep.
No,
Right?
no. You got to make sure the house stands up before you put the wallpaper on.
Mm-hmm.
If it's just going to go boom, why bother?
Yep.
And that's where a structural editor or a developmental editor will take a look at what you've written and say, does this make sense? Does it go where it's supposed to
Yep.
go? Do you have a premise that actually carries the book from beginning to end?
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of work should be done on the premise. I
Yeah.
always recommend um, that you really work hard on getting your premise right,
Yes.
and then you can wrap your story around it, and it becomes the rudder for all the things that you put in your story.
Mm-hmm.
Does your story feed that premise? Does it move it
Yep.
forward? Does it take you to the end that you wanted? This is the craft of it. And you after you done your first draft, there it may already be there, but the first draft might be just a bunch of pieces on the table that you
Yep.
have to arrange. Okay,
Yep. My
you
friend
do
has
that.
described it as putting sand into the sandbox that you can then turn into a castle.
Possibly, possibly, yeah, that's true. um, and it may fall apart.
Yeah.
You need some kind of glue to keep it together. But the next thing is the line, the music of the lines.
Mm-hmm.
That's where a line editor comes in. It says, you know what, this sentence is too long. Let's work it out. It slows the pacing down.
Yep.
Let's break it up. So these are the skills of somebody who knows how to take your work and take it to the next level
Mm-hmm.
until you know how to do that yourself.
Yep.
And when you have written a very well developed, very well crafted book, then you get the kind of editor that can take it yet to another level.
Are all your
So,
commas correct?
well, what?
Are all your commas correct?
Oh my gosh. I did a proofread on something, and there were so many Oxford commas missing that I went back to the publisher and I said, "Do you have a policy on the Oxford commas? Because there's no Oxford commas in here." And
Ugh.
they came back and they said, "Yes, we believe in the Oxford comma." I said, "All right." I,
Yep.
this was obviously a transcript from a motivational speaker that used the three
Yep.
segment example. I put over 100 Oxford commas back in this manuscript. You know,
I knew we were friends for a reason.
but see, now that's the function of a copy editor, because
Mm-hmm.
I was at the proofreading point and I said, no, this should be fixed by now.
Yep.
Is the copy edit incomplete? But so let's build the house again. Does the house stand up? Are the rafters in all the right places?
Mm-hmm.
Will the supporting walls hold it? Okay, then, you know, have you put on the wallpaper? Have you painted the walls? Right, it's gorgeous. Now sweep up the mess that you left on the
Yep.
floor, and now do the walkthrough.
Mm-hmm.
It it is four different layers
Yes.
of editing, and you know there was there was a time I was helping with some people who had signed up for editing, and a person presented her two chapters, and I said, really, I'm sorry, I can't find anything to improve on this. This is beautiful. This is really beautiful. Turns out it was a pen name best-selling author. And I thought, oh,
Yep.
thank God I didn't dabble in something that was
Yep.
already done well.
Mm-hmm.
But that's where it is. There is the personality of the voice that comes through,
Yep.
the way it's
Absolutely.
written, the way it flows. There's so many
Mm-hmm.
parts to it,
Yeah.
and I think authors learn to be disciplined. And this takes me into my other favorite topic, is to remind writers that it is the mastery of the word, the sentence, the paragraph, the chapter, the book that gives you the most pleasure.
Yep.
This is where you live. You live to wake up in the middle of the night rewriting that sentence.
Yeah.
You know, you live to get to the end of a chapter and say, "Oh yeah, that's where I chop it off," because
Absolutely.
that's where I tease the reader into reading
Yep.
the next page,
Yep.
which of course should be a new chapter because you want them to wait through another chapter.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't this a lot of fun? I mean,
Oh yeah. Like as an
the
author,
whole
there's.
process, the whole process, I believe, is based in mastery.
Mm-hmm.
The pleasure in getting the sentence right, the pleasure in
Mm-hmm.
in getting the story right. And then, yeah, you do have to take it to a market, but you do the best you can in a market that is not your friend. You cannot control what happens in the market.
Yep.
You can do the best you can to put it in the best place.
Yes.
But look at all the pleasure you've already received from doing it.
So the because I agree with you. You can't be a writer without being passionate about it and about finding a lot of deep fulfillment in it because nobody probably gets into this work to get rich, or if they are, they learn quickly that you don't. Not
Or they would get
unless you're
rich
very rare.
accidentally and then they pursue it further.
Yes. And but most people don't end up getting rich as an author most of the time. Like the vast majority of us don't become Stephen King. We never become Stephen King. We sell books and find it rewarding and we connect with readers and we love what we do. We might even be able to make a living at it, but we're not probably going to be Stephen King. Like for me, my writing is something I'm deeply passionate about, but my editing supports my writing endeavors because my editing is where my money comes from.
There is that.
And that's a thing. And the joy and pleasure of crafting a really good book that connects with people, that people respond to, that's really where that is for me. Like, yes, I would like to earn more money on book sales. Yes, I need to market better. Yes, I need to do more positioning. I know that. I know that about myself. But I also find a deep amount of joy in the fact that I have people who started out as fans and have become really good friends, like lifelong friends of mine, who just they were fans who connected with me and talked with me early on when I didn't have any, and we've become genuine close friends now.
Mhm.
And there's a pleasure there. I have.
I parallel it to people who don't write. I parallel it to people who go to football games. The
Mm-hmm.
joy that they get from investing in going to football games, they bring back with them. They bring back to barbecues with them, just like we
Yep.
bring back what we love to do to book clubs.
Mm-hmm.
It's all worth it. It
Yes.
definitely is all worth it. But I don't want to forget to go back to the business of
Yes.
book selling, the business of selling. You wear your hat as a writer, and then if you're going to take it into the marketplace, you're a business person.
Yep. You're an entrepreneur
And
at
there
that
are
point.
so many parts of that. And I would encourage people to learn about that so that
Yes.
they do it well,
Mm-hmm.
because it is satisfying to write the book. It is also satisfying to do the work well. Oh, and I believe that I'm running out of battery on my laptop.
Uh-oh. Well, then we will
Oh,
wrap it up here. Maybe we'll come back for another talk about some of these topics that we just kind of barely brushed on because we had some
I
great
think we got
times
a,
with
a
this.
big a big
Yeah.
overview, didn't we?
So thank
Oh
you
my
so we
gosh.
did. We had a great time. Thank you so much
We've
for
been
being here, Pam. It has been an
Oh,
absolute
thank
delight,
you, Ellis.
and
This has
we will
been
absolutely do
fun.
this again.
Oh yeah, we always have a lot to talk about, don't
We
we?
do. We
I
really
hope
do.
this has been helpful, and let people know that they can get in touch with me by email, um,
Yeah. I'll
via
I'll put
Ellis.
your
Then I'll know.
I'll put your links and stuff down below and let people know how to find you.
Terrific. And next time I'm going to plug in before I sit down with you.
Probably a good idea. I will talk to you again.
All right. Thanks a lot, Ellis.
Thank you so much. Take care.